That, I want to then turn it over to Colin Rose, who is the Assistant Superintendent of Opportunity and Achievement Gaps from Boston Public Schools. And what he's going to do is share a narrative from a student perspective. So we've asked Colin to step in to the shoes of a student. And from that student perspective, give us a narrative of what it's like to be a low-income student of color in Boston Public Schools. So, Colin.
Yeah, so I joined a group at Aspen Institute this July, beautiful Aspen, and I had this question posed to me that I was to present as a student of color in Boston. It was kind of weird because they exist, and we could ask them, but I played one on TV about 20 years ago, so I did my best to try to channel that and to use kind of the experiences that I've had walking across the district and some of the things that I've seen, especially related to social emotional learning. So this is a moment in time when I kind of put down some words on paper. I'm going to try to read it like I did in the summer and see if it still kind of squares with my thinking now. I kind of titled it, What We Have Normalized. My journey will mostly start at a school with less resources than my white middle-class counterparts, both within and outside of my district. Upon kindergarten, I will most likely come into an environment that will not reflect me as a hero, a princess, or in many places as anything, both in society and in school. I will notice this and begin to internalize inferiority. But most of my teachers will not explicitly deal with this, and thus I will start labeling myself as bad, many times in assessments supported by the school that I go to. Think Dr. Kermit and Mimi Clark's DALT test. Through elementary school, I would begin to be the target of disproportionate punishment, even as I am behaving in a developmentally appropriate manner. Yale University Ziegler Institute research. As I go into later elementary, I will be seen as needing less support emotionally and projected to be more aggressive, less innocent, and older than I am. I will be treated as such. Girlhood interrupted, Georgetown Law. If I'm truly unlucky, I might make it to a school that claims to be high performing, only to be confronted with a 200-page long behavioral rule book. Had a graduate student in the class I taught who talked about how the first year at one of these schools, they try to break the kids. Think Carlisle schools. As I move from middle school to high school, I will disproportionately have younger, less experienced teachers. I have less access to high rigor coursework such as AP. I will most likely not be exposed to authors that push me towards critical consciousness such as Baldwin or Carter G., both because it's unlikely my teachers have heard of or read of these authors. In addition, it's how we define the classics that need to be read in schools. The majority of staff of color I encounter in my schools will be paraprofessionals, deans of discipline, and security officers. Think the overseer, fueling further internalized racism and savior complexes. In math class, we will not explore wealth inequality, compound interest, health disparities, or Haitian reparations to France and the connection to the economy of Haiti today. Schools will be the only place where math isn't contextualized in our lived experience. And don't get me started on history. If I do happen to get from a great teacher, a great school, a parent, an uncle, somebody in the community, to push to think critically about my conditions, and I'm able to put in words and act on that awareness, I at best will not be listened to, and at worst will be labeled defiant, even as cultural wealth models note resistance as an important skill for marginalized individuals. In the end, the best I can do right now is cope with it and have caring adults help me navigate through. Some may call it grit, others may call it submission.
Wow, as I think about that, I think about that, that as a testimony to the experience in Boston, but so much of the learned and lived experiences for so many young people throughout the country. And so I'd love to just go ahead and open this up a little bit. I want to get right into it with you, so with all of you. So what I'd love to have you do is to talk about how you frame the intersection of social, emotional, academic development and issues of equity. I'd love to have you talk about it in the context of what you do in your classrooms, in your districts. And so just make sure the context of what you're facing every day and what you're doing every day comes across in your answer.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, y'all weak. Good morning.
Good morning.
I taught first period this morning before I came here, and so I'm dialed in right now. So I teach AP Government and Human Geography here in Tacoma, Washington. I work at Lincoln High School, which is about 1.25 miles that way, in a part of town that most of you aren't going to visit while you're here. And I work with a population of students who doesn't look like this room or most of Washington State. What I often say to people is, I live in a state that's 80% white and work at a school that's 80% students of color. And so that right there creates some very profound emotional baggage and issues that students are aware of, but we don't talk about oftentimes in play company. And so I think about a few things, just the idea that students learn from people they love, and they learn in places where they're valued. And if we look at our students who aren't performing or are underperforming on whatever measures we create, that's one of the major issues. Why would I consistently as a student show up day after day to a place where I don't feel valued and put an effort into this long-term project that has no long-term meaning and purpose to me? And so I'm really thankful to work in Tacoma schools. We have a program, you mentioned access to AP. We do a thing in Tacoma called academic acceleration, where basically if you can function in a classroom, you're in an AP class whether you want to or not. And my principal and my administrators are really great to me. They've always said we care about total pass numbers, not pass rates. And so what we're trying to do is get more kids with access to rigor, more kids with a highly engaged curriculum, more kids with a challenge, and we don't worry about pass rates. And some things I love about Tacoma, Tacoma funds test the exam fees. And so think about that. We often talk about increasing rigor in schools, but we do things so backwards sometimes. In other places, you push low-income kids to AP classes, and at the end of the year say, hey, there's an AP exam coming for you for $90. That's crazy. That's crazy. And so in Tacoma, what we've done is we've systematized that. So students get access to that curriculum, and they benefit. Just demographically, if you know anything about education, you know that demography is often determination. Tacoma schools has no business beating Seattle schools the way we do in various indices, but we do because we value our students. And not only do we value our students, but we do a job empowering our staff. My boss is over in the corner, and if he wasn't here, I'd be saying the same things, frankly. I work with a population of students who are challenged more than other students in the state, but they also have the emotional support and get wraparound services they need to make it happen. And that's the work of closing gaps.
Sydney?
So I agree with a ton of that. I work in Boston. I'm actually not in Boston Public Schools. I'm in a charter school in Boston. And, I represent the average, as Nate's wife would say, interchangeable white lady who teaches in schools, right? And I'm teaching mostly students of color, students who are growing up in very different situations than I grew up in, with very different lived experiences. And so for me, where I see the intersection of seed and equity and where I see the heart of our work is very similar to what Nate was saying. It's in seeing kids as humans. It's in recognizing their humanity. And that's gotta be at the core of seed, and it's gotta be at the core of equity. And so thinking about relationships and thinking about this issue of loving our students and knowing our students and building relationships with them and starting all of our work from there, that's where I see the intersection. And it's especially important work for me to do as a white woman coming in to a school where, the kids have no reason to trust me implicitly. They have no reason to believe that I might be different from any of the other teachers that they've had who maybe have not formed relationships with them or have not valued them as individuals or have not seen their humanity. So I need to work especially hard to educate myself and to make sure that I'm doing them justice and that I'm educating myself and seeing their humanity and keeping that at the center.
Yeah, so I work on multiple levels of the district. So we have programming out of my office, one specifically called 10 Boys, which is a rites of passage affirmation class targeted towards boys of color, but anybody can really take it. in which we are looking at kind of cultural wealth models around what the strengths that students are coming in with, and how do you represent some of these self skills in a maybe different way that a survey doesn't get at, right? So if you work at live in a multi-family house, how does that show some sort of cooperation versus some of the items you might get on a typical survey, right? So while we're doing that work, we also do a lot of capacity building with the professionals in our district, our principals, our teachers, even cabinet level now. And we've started kind of a campaign around awareness, around racial equity, right? So the construct of race, and then the historical parameters of race, the construct of it, what it meant in Boston, and then what are the manifestations of that? So then we can get into issues of white privilege, internalized racism, implicit bias, the things that everybody carries with them, but is fairly invisible. We don't quite often as a practice talk about. So we started that conversation. We had multiple sessions with principals last year, 5 or 6, continuing that this year. We're helping them craft plans at their schools to connect not only with kind of their instructional focus, but where their staff is, where they are as a leader, so we can at least go from A to B, or D to F, or if we're down the road in schools that have been dealing with it for a long time, we can kind of customize how they're addressing racial equity. To me, I don't think you can have SEED without that. What I would say, and I think that goes with curriculum and instruction, everything else. If we continue to pull SEED through the same paradigm that we pull everything else through, we are going to create another deficit model in which we're labeling kids as deficient in these areas, versus what my colleague from Minneapolis talked about. How do we look at what we are measuring and really interrogate the environments that we're creating? Because I think students innately have these abilities, but are they going to express them in the environment that you have created for them? And is that environment explicitly designed around their aspirations and their needs, or ours as adults?
So thank you all. I just will share for us in DC, one of the things that we've done is we've said that we want our students to be loved. I mean, that's where we start in terms of where we want to go, is this idea of loved, students being loved. I believe that love invites challenge. Young people, when they know that you really care about them, I mean, they really go through a wall. I think we're all kind of wired that way. One of the things that comes up oftentimes when we're talking about social emotional academic development is this inequity, is this idea that somehow we must sacrifice excellence, we must sacrifice academic rigor. I'd love to have you speak on that, and I just want to share that because I've heard that in the context of people throughout the various communities, different states, different districts, and then also sometimes policymakers. So I'd just be interested in your perspective. If you could speak on how you have, we're nationally recognized teachers up here. We have a leader in Boston who is identifying ways to lift up culturally sustaining practices to benefit marginalized students. And so you're all about excellence, you're all about equity, you're all about trying to make sure that all students feel that connection, that love. I'd love to hear you talk about just your response when you hear this idea of lowering expectations in order to do this work, or how you would rebut that type of thing.
The first thing that comes to mind, and somebody will remember if it's Lisa Delpit or not, I think it's Lisa Delpit, the phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Is that Delpit? Anyone with me? It's George Bush? That's horrible. We're gonna move past that. We're gonna move past that, Nate. We're not ever gonna bring that up again. You're definitely not. Wow. Well, okay. So let's forget about that. But I guess okay. So I feel like a lot of times in these conversations about equity becomes a code word that just means like race. We're gonna talk about kids of color, and I think what I think of when you say people feel like we have to sacrifice quality when we talk about equity and SEED. I feel like it's people feeling like kids of color can't be excellent, or that we can't do both at the same time. And I feel like we need to reject that. That's like my initial. I feel very embarrassed by what just happened. So that's my initial thought.
When you said that there's people who propose that focus on SEED slows down or waters down excellence, I had an involuntary head snap back because it's the opposite, and that's like one of the crazier things I've heard in my life, and I work with teenagers every day. I would just say this, like I had the blessing to start my career in teaching in 2006, which meant that I was teaching here in Tacoma, Washington, working with Katrina evacuees. And then I got to watch the financial crisis hit and watch families who worked in construction collapse. And okay, what happened with those kids? The evacuees who came to Tacoma, Washington were very disoriented. This is not New Orleans. This was not where they were from. And as they were getting their sea legs and getting adjusted, they didn't perform well. And for some of the students, it took a full year. But once they got acculturated to society, and once they got stability in their lives, and once their familial situations were set up and squared away, they performed. About a year later, I have I'd say about a third of my students who were Hispanic Latino, their parents worked in construction. Well, the housing market collapses. So you have families who work in the building trades who are not working in the building trades. What happens? Across the board, performance goes down. When we make sure that students' basic life needs are met, and we make sure that students feel supported and feel like they can be successful, and make sure that students feel like they have expertise and agency and have control and safety, they perform better. And like that's not complicated, but like that's the gospel truth. And if we're doing, so here's one of the things that concerns me, and granted, I got here this morning, you're all nice people, you know, I mean no offense by this. We had a pretty long conversation earlier on about how to measure seed and like what metrics to use to measure seed. But do we know what causes seed? And do we know what are the factors that contribute to seed? Because if we're having a conversation about measuring it first, before we actually know how to build it in students, then we're going down a road that's a very dangerous road to go down. And so for me, like, there's some very obvious things. Any time and money spent in the safety and the well-being of students in a classroom environment in a school, whether it's breakfast after the bell, whether it's family support staff, whether it's additional counselors, whether it's investing in higher quality teachers and curriculum, is money well spent. Like the idea that somehow by paying attention to kids' life needs, we're like ruining their academic experience, like that's poppycock at best.
I'll take it. You know, I taught for 9 years before, you know, I joined the dark side and became an administrator. But honestly, and again, I didn't run any type of test prep program, whatever. I had the highest growth scores in the city, in top 10 in the state in mathematics in middle school, right? In a school in Roxbury that is almost 100% Black and Latino. I didn't touch a math problem for 2 weeks. I had to get to know each one of the students, right? I had to support kind of what they thought about themselves and what they thought about themselves as a mathematician, which is difficult because most people will say, I'm not good at math, right? So how do you then garner a growth mindset in a way that students will then receive instruction? And I had to affirm who they were because they were students of color and are getting all these messages from society. And so that is that type of detox that you have to do before I even touch a math problem. Right? And it was time well spent. I saw teachers spinning their wheels all year trying to make connections and just going through their lesson plans. And I was like, listen, they don't care what you know until they know you care. You know, and I can't say enough, and I'm not the cell person for my district about cell, but also the intersection and the understanding of the paradigms that our students are walking in, especially students of color, are walking in on their shoulders. And the fact that our professionals need to be aware of those things, see how they contribute to those things, and break down the barriers so that you can have an authentic relationship with students that isn't based off power dynamics that are artificial.
Cindy, can you talk about just some of the practices that you utilize with your students in your school? What is it that you are doing that attracts them to your classroom, that leads to the success that they're having? I'd love to just bring some specifics into the room.
Sure. Well, they really like when I start by quoting George Bush, and then we Socratic seminar. No, I did it. Okay. So I mean, I think, you know, we're sort of broken recording here, but like, relationship building has to be at the start, and then I think it's about making sure that we're teaching in a way that kids see themselves reflected in what we're doing. So my class is called Justice and Injustice. And we look at moments, it's a humanities class, so we look at these case studies of moments in history where people have faced injustice and how they've fought for justice, and how they've defined justice. And so I feel like when when we open up those kinds of conversations and topics to our kids, when we show them that we can talk about real things that really connect to what they're thinking about, and we make the classroom a safe and okay place for them to do that, then we're addressing all sorts of stuff beyond just the academic standards. So we learn about apartheid in South Africa and the injustices that folks faced and how they fought for justice. And the kids invariably start to think about themselves, and they start to think about the Black Lives Matter movement, and they start to think about injustices in America and how they connect to their lives, and how learning about these resistance movements in apartheid could help inform their own activism or agency or citizenship. And when we do that in the classroom, and we make space for that in the classroom, and we make space for them to have emotions about the content that we're teaching from history, and we have space for them to have difficult conversations and to grapple with things like that, I think we're making space for actually SEAD, right? For social, emotional, and academic development, for a way that we can do all of that work wrapped into one. Some specific strategies that we're using, as I'm traveling across the country, I'm hearing everyone talk about restorative justice, and I think they're mostly only referring to circles. I think restorative justice, if we're gonna really do it, has to be about a lot more than circles, but I think that circles are an interesting place to start because we can use them to address conflicts in the school. We can also use them to tackle really difficult and emotional content within the classroom, and that's one thing that we're doing in our humanities classes, is when we're talking about something like children being killed during apartheid by the police for protesting, we can do a circle around that and give kids the space to process a little bit instead of just marching through the content and trying to cover things. And then the other thing I would say is just, I've been learning a lot in the last year or so about trauma-informed practices. And so making space in classrooms, we heard reference to this yesterday at the Jason Lee, they were talking about the reset desk. So having spaces in classrooms where kids can send themselves and go and just be a human for a couple minutes and realize I need something different than to sit in my desk and do this work. So we're making more spaces like that in our school as well, and in my classroom, with really great results for kids. When we show them, again, I see you as a human. I recognize, like for me a little while ago, this meeting was really interesting, but it was really long, and I had to get up and stand in the back and have a snack. And we need to give our kids that same kind of trust and like autonomy, that they can do things like that in our schools and in our classrooms, and we see that they're humans and they have needs, and they should be able to meet those needs.
Sydney, I really appreciate the, just some of the specific examples that you just gave. One of the things that I often find is that absent real context and skills, people will go to easy answers or easy identifications to why they're seeing something happening with the student or what they're experiencing. So they'll say, the student doesn't care or isn't motivated, so on and so forth, not recognizing that many times the behaviors that you're seeing are actual rational behaviors, given the circumstances that they have. Colin, looked like you wanted to chime in on that last topic.
Yeah. A couple of points. I think one point is, I think we're discussing kind of like this cautiousness piece around as a strategy to engage students of color. Although I think, and I know you guys talked about, you don't want to have a value statement of what education should be, but if we're talking about the survival of a pluralistic, democratic society, I think it's important for all students to have a level of conversation and consciousness around some of these issues, again, around gender, race, class. But before we can do that, we need to have the professionals that can be able to facilitate those have the knowledge of that and be able to facilitate those type of conversations. Thus, or we will continue, I believe, to see the divide of society, right? And then the other piece that I'd like to speak to, the last point that you made. Meeting our needs. Oh, so as we get into more progressive forms of education and even discipline, we talk about restorative justice. Again, are we still interrogating who are the students that are constantly being in the circle, right? Who are the students that are constantly doing the timeouts? Because that could also then signal an environmental issue, right? So I love the fact that we're being more humane, more personable, more relational. But are we still seeing the same patterns through a different set of actions? And so I still encourage to interrogate those pieces.
We had and it was referenced, Sydney referenced the visits yesterday, and during both visits, the students were able to highlight so many things that were going well in the school, and really, a lot of the practice resonated with the students. But one of the things that came up both times for students, both schools, was this idea of increased diversity, increased access to diversity amongst the teaching staff, so on and so forth. And I really appreciated being amongst leaders who were also able to speak about their own vulnerability in the work and that of their teachers. So I'm wondering, for you, how is it, whether it be you're working with colleagues, how do you create spaces for educators to talk about these issues of SEED and equity and meeting the needs of students? How are you thinking about that from the standpoint of the district, and what role does really just trying to increase the access to diversity play in what you're trying to do?
So much in the same way that I said earlier that teaching is relational, teaching within the profession is about trust and relationships. And I feel like if you show me a school that has a high level of SEED happening and students are growing, both academically and emotionally, then I'm going to show you a staff that is led by a leader who has a vision, and I'm going to also show you a staff that has trust in each other as colleagues. One of the things that I note in the profession is that there seems consistently to be a lack of trust from policymakers towards practitioners about the choices that we make. And one of the things that policymakers often do is treat all teachers like they're equal interchangeable parts and create like one-size-fits-all solutions for problems of equity and problems in communities. And that's something I would just implore people to not do. What we need to do more of is identifying the practices of our most effective educators, seeing what they're doing in their classrooms, and then bringing those practices to scale and replicating them instead of creating top-down solutions. But there's a lack of trust that happens when it comes to these kind of things. Here's the thing, is I actually went to Jason Lee Middle School, 1989 to 1991, and I'm sure that everybody who taught there when I was there is gone by now, but that's fine. But my point is this, there's a teacher there named Ann Hawkins, who has been there for, I think my entire life at this point. She's still there, right? So when I student taught at Jason Lee Middle School, I walked into Ann's class, and I saw kids that were running me ragged, being perfect in her room. And at that moment, I knew it was me, not the kids, right? And so I had to have a conversation with Ann about, okay, Ann, what are the things you're doing? What are the structures you have in place? Why are you being successful, and why am I not? And so she pushed back on me, well, what aren't you doing? And I had not established a relationship with the students. I had not communicated who I was and why I was there, what my values were to the students. And so the point that you made, you don't pick up a math problem until the second week of school, is the same. And I think if policymakers, when they're trying to integrate these issues, go into buildings and don't go into buildings with a set of prefabricated solutions, but actually talk to the practitioners who are being successful and see what is working, and then bring those to scale, that's a much better path for policymaking. Because the thing about education that I know from my years of policy advocacy is, and you know as well, it's incredibly decentralized. And so the solutions that work in New Orleans are not the same solutions that are appropriate at our reservation school in North Dakota, which are not the same solutions that are appropriate for the marginalized low-income students in Appalachia. But we try to approach these things with this one-size-fits-all toolkit, and that's not the way kids work. There's always this talk in education about individualized learning and individualized instruction, and far too often that's about using tech. And so we can give kids their own tracks with technology, but the real individualized instruction is approaching kids as individuals and approaching their needs and situations as individuals and coming up with solutions that are context specific. It's all right, man. It's all right. I appreciate you.
Please, go ahead, Colin.
Similarly, as a district perspective, and how do you have these conversations and create the spaces, I think everything is context bound, right? So schools have their own cultures, they have their own focus. What we try to do is support creating intentional spaces for these conversations to happen. Help provide schools resources, a toolkit but flexible, right, of resources to have text-based conversations around actual lived experiences at the school and things that they're seeing. And so it wouldn't work as a one-size-fits-all. We have 122 different schools, we have different school populations. What's happening in East Boston is much different than what's happening in Roxbury and what happened in West Roxbury. But I think having intentional spaces and resources as in actual money, and programming to get certain things done, and pushing them to schools that need more is very important, which is also part of the work that I do, is some systematic barrier work. And so again, letting the practitioners on the ground decide kind of choose their adventure, but making sure that, you create guardrails around the spaces and make sure that they have the resources they need to get those conversations started.
I want to open this up to the room to ask questions. One of the things that I do want to say as I open this up is this idea of creating space and helping people think through different applications of time for educators. So how do you create spaces for educators to be able to be in spaces not just to learn, but also have time to reflect and think upon how they might want to move from their learning to actual practice. And I think that since, and it was shared here, since so much of it's contextual, based on region and all of that, I think the more examples of how where we illuminate how schools, how teachers, how districts, school leaders are taking that on and creating those spaces, I think the better it'll be, easier it'll be for others to grasp how they might do that in the local context. But I'd love to open it up to the room and see if there are questions you'd love to have the panelists entertain. Linda?
Great panel, thank you so much. I want to draw a thread to our policy committee and then kind of leverage that into a question. I heard Sydney talk about making space for this work, and Colin talking about the first 2 weeks of school to create the relationships, and really talking about how all of you talked about how you need to have the ability to link things to kids' own lives, create the relationships. So on the policy frame, where we see the problems are when districts adopt things like pacing guides and scripted curriculum, which say on this day you have to be doing these things to cover these standards in this particular way, and often also standardize the text so that you can't personalize the text to kids' experiences and so on. So that's one of the policy things that we need to be alert to, is that you can't kind of do all the things that you all talked about and have that framework. And then that comes about in part because people don't trust educators. Andre, you mentioned that. And that comes about because we don't have a strong profession in terms of the training that Jim talked about earlier. So it kind of brings you back to what are we going to do about preparation and development and so on for educators, so that when you have strong enough preparation, people will trust you to make good decisions and still accomplish the goals, as you said. So I would just like to ask you to comment a little bit about the policy context within which this kind of work needs to go on, and maybe elaborate a little bit for those of us who are on that committee and for the commission as a whole about how we need to think about some of those issues.
Colin, you want to start?
I think you're 100% correct around over scaffolding or over prescribing exactly what schools are to do. But we're kind of in this weird paradigm where, over the past few decades, we've deprofessionalized education, right? So the skills that people were coming out of at ed schools were to be following those types of plans. We were not developing teachers explicitly in most of our schools of ed to think about the whole child, right? And so now we're kind of playing catch up with staff members. We have the ability to front load things for people coming into the district, but we have, most of our teaching population isn't going anywhere. So just thinking about how do we have the room to do the professional development with teachers to get them to that level. Something in Boston, and a lot of it has to do around unions, is the amount of time that teachers have for professional development. And it gets very difficult and a very crowded space to then try to build in some of these conversations and skills outside of the school day and in different arenas. So I would think about the structures and policies that will allow for the spaces to be created to do the work.
Yeah, one thing that I always try to push when I'm talking to policymakers is teachers have to be more than just sort of token representations at these conversations. Teachers have to be included as actual participants in conversations about policy, as actual participants in conversations about the effects of policy in our classrooms. And I see too often that teachers are not truly respected in those conversations as experts. There was an example, there was a slide this morning, and it was talking about what are our audiences, and it said number 1, the experts. And I thought, oh, cool, they're talking about us. And then number 2 was teachers. And I was like, oh man, we're not the experts. Okay, so it's a small thing, right? Like, that seems like a semantics issue, but really I see so often in these conversations that I go into, teachers are not seen as experts in this work. And we're seen sort of as, okay, tell me your little story about your kid. All right, now the adults are gonna go talk, And I just really want to encourage you to have more teachers truly represented in your conversations and really listen to what we're saying, because teachers are experts in kids. We are experts in what this looks like. And I've heard a lot of talk about, in the last couple of days about, well, how will we get teachers on board, or how will we convince teachers? You don't need to convince teachers. Teachers know the importance of the work. We're doing the work. So it's about how can we work in partnership with teachers? How can we ensure that our shared vision between policymakers and teachers is something that can come to fruition?
And I'll add to that list students and communities and families, right? These are subjects that are living, breathing things. So how are we bringing in their voice?
I echo almost everything that you said, particularly what you added about students and families. And then to the point that you made also about pacing guides, one of the things that we do is that when we adapt things or adopt things, we adopt things for the entire profession. In my first year, if you would have given me a pacing guide and a day by day, I would have been like, thank God, right? But in year 12, when I've been doing government for 6 years and geography for 5 years, if you hand me a pacing guide, I'm like, what are you doing right now? What are you right? And so we have to know when those things and prescriptions are appropriate and know when they're not, and not treat all teachers like they're the same, because they're not.
That's a great point. And that pacing guide, if you have one, or if you have some scaffolds for beginning teachers, ought to include that first week when you are just building the relationships with your students. It ought to include, whatever frameworks and guidelines ought to include the relationship components of being a good teacher, rather than coverage of, curriculum factoids, one by one by one. We kind of have to think about that. As somebody who teaches adolescent development in a program where we spend a lot of time on this and people come out very well prepared in this area, I think we got to figure out how to hold up the places that are doing this work and figure out how to expand it with the help of educators who are doing it.
Other questions, ideas from the room? Please.
Hi. So curious, what resources do you feel would help teachers do more of this? Or what barriers would you remove that would enable more teachers to do more of this?
When you say of this,
With the relationships up front, the intentionally getting to know people, the giving people opportunity to wrestle with the embedding social emotional into the academic. I mean, probably the 8 other things you all have sort of just summarized in this conversation that we also heard yesterday and today.
So I'm biased, but I am part of the EL Education Network. It used to be called Expeditionary Learning. It was part of Outward Bound. You guys know them because you used Capital City in one of your recent publications. But I think the EL model is a really strong one for SEAD. I think it's they're not calling it SEL. They're not calling it SEAD. They're calling it character development plus quality work plus something else. I should know that. But I think that the work that EL is doing is a really strong model, and they work with all kinds of schools, and they have lots and lots of stuff available online. So I tend to think that's a really good resource for schools.
I chuckled to myself earlier on when somebody mentioned that Sacramento's going on strike. So I help lead an organization called Teachers United, who's a policy advocacy group led by teachers. And one of the things we've come to is that time is the same as money when it comes to compensation. And if there's one thing that especially mid-career educators need, it's more time, right? But there's not time. There's a 55-minute class period, and then a planning period, and then a class period, then a class period, then a class period, then lunch, and right? And so I don't have the opportunity, or unless it's created intentionally, there aren't opportunities to go see other teachers. There's not opportunities to go watch other people work. There's not opportunities to sit down and have facilitated conversations. And so I would say one thing that policymakers can do is to somehow find ways to buy out and give more time to their effective educators so they can like be demonstration places and also be models. The other thing I want to address kind of just is a vocabulary term that's getting used in the conversation about grit. My skin gets a little rough when I hear the word grit, because we talk about like who has grit and doesn't have grit. If you are existing in 2017 as a low-income brown person, you have grit coming out of every pore that you have in this moment in American history. And so I always want to just caution us on that. When we talk about who has grit and doesn't have grit, like a lot of you cannot imagine like what it takes to face what America is throwing at poor brown kids every day.
And from my perspective, it's creating the opportunities for cross collaboration, curating tools and resources, and also helping people again have. And I'm going to push us towards the uncomfortable conversations that belie some of the relational pieces in our classrooms, especially when there's cross-cultural conflict between our teachers and the population of students that they serve. So I think those are important, actually, content-laden pieces that people need to be reading, discussing in PLCs, in team meetings, and addressing. Because until we do that, then again, we're going to pull it through the same paradigm.
One more specific resource, Christopher Emden's book, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. I think it's just an amazing resource, super smart, really challenged my thinking about how I do this work. And one of the reasons I really like it, and I recommend it to so many teachers, is that it's grounded in like lots of theory, and it's also got these chapters where he literally just lays out step by step, okay, here's how you're gonna go about building more trusting relationships with your kids. Here's what you do on day 1, and here's what you do on week 4, and it's incredible. So that's, I think, a really great resource that we should all read, and it can spur some really great conversations among educators, and it's got those practices in it.
Colin, go ahead.
And I'll plug, I think you guys are working with Zaretta Hammond and her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. She does a very good job of breaking down seed or cell or whatever you want to call it, equity, and then how students' brains actually function developmentally. So I think that's been an eye-opener. It's a book that a lot of our schools are using in book study currently, and we're hoping to have her out in the spring to do session.
And I would just add also that nobody's going to be able to implement this well if it's seen as additive to their work. And so like we also need to have conversations about what we're taking off people's plates.
Yeah, I appreciate all of those comments, as well as again this piece around time. I mean, I don't think that can be. I think that one of the things that I find when I'm talking with leaders, talking with educators, is sometimes they struggle with different ways to think about how this could work. Or how to find time regularly. They're struggling with it, and then you go to other places and they have really thought this through. And so I think that the more that we are lifting up different examples and ways that people are approaching in different contexts, I think the better. I want to see if there are additional questions or comments from the room. Please.
Nate, hearing your question, what can we should we take off of your list?
So one of the things that Tacoma Schools has done is they've put in, at least in my high school, a family support specialist. And so her job is, if a kid shows up without glasses, says the power is off, doesn't have shoes, shows up repeatedly in the same clothes, instead of me taking on that work in my classroom and trying to find resources, which is how it used to be, we have a dedicated specialist named Mrs. Ha, who works in the school, and I can send kids to Mrs. Ha. And so what that allows me to do is, there's a time 2 years ago where Lincoln High School's entire front office became a food bank for the holidays, because frankly, our kids eat 2 meals a day at school, and if they're not eating in school, often don't eat. And so what's happening to like the efficacy of the building when the entire front office is a food bank for kids for the holidays? So we have a family support center now where that work's happening there. And again, it's part of the whole child. If you put support staff in buildings who are able to help take care of students' basic life needs, that can take that off of teacher and counselor's plates, so we can focus on teaching and counseling. And so like her presence in the building has been revolutionary for me. I had a student about a month ago, and I'm just like looking at him sitting in the third row of the class, and he's just leaning in, and I'm like, fam, where are your glasses? And he's like, I don't have glasses. I lost them, whatever. I'm like, go see Ha. Next day, leaning in. 2 days later, glasses, right? Changes his learning. Like he literally says, this is what you guys been talking about the whole week? Oh, I can see the map now. And I'm like, come on, man, right? But like, If him getting glasses is dependent on me, like hustling social connection, that's not going to happen. And so, particularly at our lowest income schools, like we should be putting staff in to help meet students' life needs, take care of the whole child.
Okay.
So Colin has mentioned a couple of times sort of interrogating our schools and interrogating environments and policies to make sure that they're really working for kids. Is that fair?
I'll take that. Yeah.
Okay. So last year, for example, I was on hallway duty. And hallway duty was I was supposed to sit in the hall at a desk and like harass kids, and then like literally like chase them, slow-mo, chase them to try to get them to go back to class, and like do laps trying to chase them and get them to go back to class, and then like threaten them. And it was such a poor use of my time. And I could have been getting better at my own practice. I could have been coaching. I could have been doing all these things. But instead, the way that it was looked at was like, oh no, we can't take that off your plate. That's really important work. Actually, what we're going to do, though, is we're going to put another staff member there, too. Instead of looking at what's flawed here, where we have to have 2 staff members chasing children around the school because they don't want to be in class. We actually need to be looking at what's happening in class so that those kids don't want to be in there. So I think just looking a little bit at how are we using teachers' time and staff members' time, and are we using it in ways that's efficient and effective, or are we using it in ways that like seems convenient because we don't actually want to address the underlying issue, which is much harder, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think systematically some of the stuff that Nate said, like trying to do that for a school, right? So how do you take some of those services off a school or provide them in a timely manner so that the school isn't hustling? It's also kind of just around the different frameworks and documentation that we're sending down to schools in our expectations. So how do we prioritize and how do you synthesize some of the things that we want teachers to be doing every day in their classroom that aren't coming from 8 different offices with 8 different frameworks. And so one thing we've attempted to do in Boston, and we have kind of an instructional roundtable with my office, the Office of English Language Learners, Special Education, Academics, and Social Emotional Learning, to talk about what is a framework we can kind of all agree to. It's called the Essentials to Instructional Equity, and what are some essential practices that do honor to all of our different frames that we can push down the schools in a simple way that teachers can understand and actually accomplish, instead of pushing our own 10, 12 frameworks down and expecting them to synthesize it at the school level.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece, and I think it makes me think back to this idea of not trying to provide a one national construct as to what education should be, and then also just one of the things I often talk about with my team is, teachers don't have time to go through the mental gymnastics of how to shape everything in that we're talking about. How do you make it as simple as possible and actually have them share some things back up to us? Roger.
Earlier we were trying to think through a theory of action, something that could support teachers across the country doing a combination of SEL and equity, and we're trying to look at, well, what are the levers? And you could say, and you've already identified so many things, from communities of practice within a school district, support from superintendents or principals or policy or unions. We could go on. I'm just wondering if you were to recommend to the commission some of the most important things that could be done to support widespread quality school, family, community partnerships to do this work, but things that would help you and more broadly teachers across the country doing this. Where's your priority levers that you might point us towards?
Large bureaucracies respond to things that are held accountable for publicly. Tacoma Schools has had a really amazing turnaround over the last about 10 years about graduation rates, because we were shamed about graduation rates, and rightfully so, in the past. I was on my state's ESSA policy, like writing our policy recommendations for accountability, and one of the things that I found was we wanted to include some of these aspects in the accountability, and a lot of the superintendents did not want them there. And what happens with bureaucracies is they respond to what they're held accountable to. And so if that's in indices, and then based on results of that indices, we drive additional funding and services, then we can kind of get change. The other thing I would say is I've talked about this for years with friends of mine who work in the PTA. I just want to imagine what would happen if we went to every low-income high school in the United States, or elementary school, start where you want to, and just guarantee that every kid got, when they showed up at school and before they left, one high-quality, nutritious, real meal, a second high-quality, nutritious, real meal, and a snack to go home. Like, so much of like the dysfunction that we see in classrooms is really about basic life needs being met. And I think for a lot of us who are like middle class and fly across the country often, like we really can't wrap our head around how disruptive a lack of predictability can be in somebody's life. And the fact that like kids aren't bored, they're hungry. Kids aren't bad, they're hungry. Kids aren't disengaged, they're hungry. And I think that's really a factor that like we haven't gotten our head around that we really should. Like up and down the West Coast in our major cities, like homelessness is exploding. And okay, like how interested am I in this conversation about Supreme Court appointments and federalism at 8:30 in the morning when my stomach's growling and like I didn't have a safe place to sleep at night? Or I'm worried about my uncle being deported. Or I'm worried about I can't go in the bathroom because I'm trans, or. Like all these factors, all these safety things, like are really huge. And so the short answer to your question is like basic student needs and safety. Like money towards basic student needs and safety will pay dividends.
I agree with that. I guess another thing that I think a lot about is, and I think Colin mentioned this earlier, but we know that teachers are passionate about doing this work. We know that teachers believe in this work, but teachers don't always have the support that they need or the training that they need to know how to do the work really well. So thinking about how we can put resources and time into training teacher leaders to be leaders in this work and in then leading and teaching other teachers and modeling for other teachers how to do it, and then B, just really making time and space for high quality professional development to help teachers get better at this work. Not to tell us why it's important, but it's the shift that Karen suggested earlier. Not what was it? How we learn, but let us learn, or something like that. How learning happens, but let learning happen. Right? It's sort of that shift. So I think just sort of rethinking what PD looks like and how we empower teachers to help be drivers of that PD around doing this stuff really well.
Okay. Coincidentally, we do have a lead teacher program in Boston. That's basically this year we're just working with them and cultivating problems of practice at their school site that they're seeing, so they can be leaders with their principals in their schools. I think this committee can first of all just be the strongest advocate possible around this work actually happening at the schools. So your voice just in general and leadership. I agree with Nate around measurement. Like I don't know how you add that into the accountability system, but again, there's a reason why there are certified ELL teachers in front of every kid lawsuit, right? There's a reason why there's certified special education professionals in front of students with special needs lawsuit, right? So we are very reactive as school systems and as states and really at the country. These are the ways that people move on issues. So we can't use that lever in this case, but I think the closer we can get to thinking about how do you actually hold people accountable for this work, and I don't have the answer today, I think you're going down the right road.
Yeah, I think that last set of comments really speak to some recommendations that they all have for us. But I do want to give them one last opportunity. If there's anything that you felt was left unsaid in terms of for the commission, we think about this work of intersection between seed and equity. If there's just any last thoughts that or recommendations you'd love to share, I'd love to give you this opportunity, and we'll close out.
I think not only around pushing the message of seed, but also thinking more holistically about what seed could look like. I talked a little bit around consciousness. I think is a actual skill that students need, and especially low-income students of color, that I don't think gets spelled out quite. I don't know, maybe it's hidden in some of the stuff that we talk about in seed. And the thought of what collectivism looks like. A lot of this stuff is very individualistic, but how do we have a collective impact as individuals within a society, almost as citizenship? If Andre was here, I know he'd be talking about citizenship. How do we build that into also what we talk about as seed? If our goal, and you don't want to get into the goals of education, but if our goal is to support a democratic, pluralistic society, how do we embed that into seed?
This is a part of your work, but I just want to sort of underscore it and say I agree with it, and it's important that we not think of seed as something that only certain subgroups of kids need. That it's not an intervention that only kids of color need or only kids with special needs need, right? That seed is something, and that's why we're calling it, I'm saying we, but it's you, I don't know. I assume that's why you're calling it seed and not just SEL, right? Because it's for all kids and it's an integral part of learning. So I just want to applaud you for having that be a part of how you think and talk about this, and encourage you to really continue pushing that message forward, because I think so often when we talk about, I tried to say this earlier, but like when we talk about equity, we think that we're only talking about certain groups of kids, but equity is an issue that affects everyone, and it's an issue that all teachers and all kids need to be sort of wrapped up in, and it's the same thing with SEED. So yeah, I just want to sort of underscore that.
I would just say, we understand that like taking care of students' social emotional needs actually accelerates their learning. And so I would say to each one of you, this is a challenge I often give is think about where you work and where you serve and what your purview is. And think about either by reputation or data or anecdote even, who are like the 5 most impactful educators in your area. And then think about when's the last time you talked to them. And so like my thing would say, if you're the governor of a state, if you're a senator someplace, you're on a school board, you run a nonprofit, you run, when is the last time you sat down with 5 practitioners who are truly impactful in your community and asked like what's happening in their schools? That's where the answers reside.
Join me in thanking the panel.